Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Around our spinning and ever more troubled globe, we're in an age of crisis, we're in an age of change, and the change is coming much more quickly. Moves towards the multipolar world are now at least a quarter of a century old, since the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was set up primarily by China and Russia back on June the 15th, 2001. But President Trump's on, off again, soon to be on again war against Iran, and the threat to global energy supplies moving through the Gulf of Hormuz. And the threat that that causes also, as we've explored in previous shows, to not just the energy complex, but to the food producing complex throughout Asia, which is dependent upon miracle wheat and rice crops, which require enormous inputs of fertilizer, which require enormous inputs in turn of oil, makes the Gulf of Hormuz choke point more crucial than ever. So we see two simultaneous crises. The multipolar world order is now coming online as even the fading credibility of Make America Great Again, Trumpism in the United States is fading away. And we have the potential for an energy and even global famine and food production crisis far worse than anything anybody has experienced in hundreds of years. We are privileged to have rising young, very rightly highly thought of analyst who is an expert on these matters, unusual combination of expertise, and that is Cameron Macgregor down in South Carolina. Cam, how dangerous is the global threat to food supplies from what President Trump is doing and not doing in the Gulf of Hormuz, in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for having me. I'm glad we started off with an easy question. Thanks for that. It's
Always
funny.
start with softballs.
It's funny because we like to use this term, particularly in the West these days, expert. And I think given the turmoil in global affairs right now and national affairs, obviously in the United States, we just had an election which was pregnant with meaning and consequence in Kentucky, in which one of the last remaining vestiges of sanity in the U.S. Congress was summarily dismissed by a power
Correct.
structure that I think is dead set on catalyzing a crisis, as you say, that we probably haven't seen for 100 years. Certainly not for the last 30 years since the Cold War ended. Well, I feel inexpert on any given day because of the deluge of information. But what I would say at the beginning is to pick up on this theme of global change. So I think it was Lao Tzu who said, nature takes its time, yet everything is accomplished. Well, in some sense, what we're seeing now unfold in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, I think in East Asia as well, is the realization of tectonic plates that began shifting about 20 years ago. I mean, you mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Obviously, you could talk about the Shanghai Gold Exchange. There's any number of
Precisely.
incremental steps that have occurred over the last 20 years. But the world, and specifically in the West, we've kind of ignored them. I don't think there's any question about them. We probably don't really understand them. And in the global South, or the global majority, if you want to use those terms, specifically powers like Russia and China, they haven't been particularly assertive about those structural changes. Maybe they don't even have the confidence quite yet to
I agree.
flex the muscle that they've got. Well, it seems to me that's beginning to change. And I
I
think this
agree.
summit that just occurred in China, and by the way, I've spent some time in China. I was in Hong Kong for several months back in 2019 at an interesting time because at that particular moment in time there were a lot of protests because there was this sense in Hong Kong um, on the heels of an extradition treaty or an extradition law that was supposedly going to be passed that would allow Beijing to backdoor dissent by imprisoning people that spoke out against the regime in Hong Kong, which was supposed to be independent. So that sparked a lot of protests. But I was there during many of them, and there were a lot of Western journalists on the ground that were talking about the wellspring of democracy or a color revolution. You know, these kind of terms that reflect a frame of mind that goes back to the 90s,
Exactly.
certainly the Cold War. But that world is over. And so what was happening on the ground essentially is that the Chinese incrementally were reintegrating Hong Kong just the way I think they're going to do in Taiwan. There wasn't an outright fight. The
Exactly.
Chinese don't do things that way, which is news to people in DC, but they don't. They sort of slowly assimilate what they perceive to be the children back into the house of the parent. That's the way the Chinese view it. In any case, I think this summit in China was revealing because President Xi told Donald Trump in rather direct terms, which is not always preferred by the Chinese. Number one, clean up the mess in the Straits of Hormuz, a mess that you have started and the world is suffering for. And number two, do not meddle in the affairs of the Chinese and the Chinese goals in East Asia. Both were, I think, categorical statements, I think, red lines to some degree. Unfortunately, the lesson, or rather the takeaway from the intelligentsia in DC, who are all dinosaurs at this stage, who don't recognize the power shifts that I just mentioned, was to double down. And I think that's what we will do. We will continue to be coercive. We will continue to escalate, thinking that because the Chinese, because the Russians and others have veered in favor of negotiation, that that's a sign of weakness. That's the way it's interpreted, unfortunately, in DC. That is not the case. These are responsible powers that realize the precarity of the situation. Unfortunately, as I said, people in the West do not. And to answer your question in a roundabout way, it is also not appreciated what starting this war in Iran has done. It has
Correct.
been a compound fracture, not just to the global energy complex, but also, as you say, to downstream consequences to include fertilizer and other inputs that are vital for the standard of living across the world, to include, by the way, the United States, which is not fully immunized from the repercussions of this war either. Okay, so this is a major shift that is bigger than the shift that occurred when the special military operation started in 2022. And I'm sad to say that the reaction to this crisis, which should be we screwed up, that the president and his cohort should essentially withdraw. Well, they're not going to do that. Instead, I think they're on the cusp of ordering another final, ultimate strike on Iran that they think will bring that regime down or at least to heel. I have reason to believe that that is not what's going to happen, that I think you're going to see the world transition from a crisis. We are in a crisis, we're in an economic crisis. We are beginning to feel the effects of inflation. We're beginning to feel the effects of shortages, certainly shortages in petrochemicals, but obviously in fertilizers. Major countries like India, in particular, are making announcements about adjusting at a national level. I mean, this is a very big deal. Obviously, India, not a small country, largest population in the world. And what's about to happen is we're going to, I think, pivot into an emergency. And that is going to start to make landfall in Western Europe as well as parts of Asia. But I would say, as an aside, I actually think that the Asians are better prepared for this crisis than people realize. And the West, specifically Western Europe, is severely worse prepared than people realize.
Are
Would
the
you go into?
Americans? Sorry.
Yes, please. I think that's these are crucial points you've just made, Cam. I fully agree with you on both grounds. Can you, for our viewers, what you said will come as, for most of them, I think, as shocking news. Would you explore further why the East Asians are better prepared and especially why the Europeans are worse prepared?
Yeah, well, let's start with China first. So it's not just that the Chinese have a strategic reserve that's the largest in the world. By the way, it's I think two, maybe three times bigger than what we have in the United States. So the all-time low, I think, was back in 2023 under Biden. We had I want to say 350 some odd million barrels in the strategic reserve, somewhere in that neighborhood. We're going to fall below that very soon. because the president, President Trump, has authorized the release under certain conditions of barrels of oil to cushion the blow from the war. And remember, gas prices in the United States are already rising, especially in major states like California, where they get about half of their crude oil supply from the Middle East, from the Persian Gulf. Whoops. So again, you have to be careful when you make blanket statements, and the president obviously is well known for that, in which he says the United States is energy independent and we stand to benefit from this conflict and we can plug the gap conceivably from what's lost in the Straits of Hormuz. Those statements are simply not correct. They may have the specter of truth or veracity when you look at them holistically, because we do export a lot of oil, we do have a robust energy sector. But when you look at the details, that's just not the case. But conversely, in East Asia, it's not just that the Chinese have a large reserve. They also have built refineries so they can refine. In other words, they can take this sort of raw product and they can refine it, ship it to countries like Australia. They also have onboarded, and this is very important, the industrial capacity of the United States into mainland China. Now, when you do those kinds of things, you're importing human capital at every level of the industrial supply chain. So it's not to say that the Chinese are not going to be hurt by this. It is to say that they can absorb the shock. And remember that they're building out mass numbers of modular nuclear reactors. They have a lot of coal plants, and they have electrified a lot of their metropolitan areas. So China in particular is well prepared for this. Now, Singapore and some other Asian countries, they also have built up large reserves in stark contrast to Australia and what you see in Western Europe, which, as far as I can tell, in countries like the United Kingdom, for example, did virtually nothing post special military operation in 2022 to wean themselves off of dependency on exports. And one other thing here that's very important for your audience to understand, a lot of the Europeans will say, well, even if we lose Qatar energy, we could just pivot to the United States. Well, listen, if energy prices surge structurally higher in the United States, guess what we'll do?
Exactly.
We will cut off exports. And that means the UK in particular, Germany, they're in big trouble. And I think that's what's going to happen.
Well, Europe
Why
already
is,
has, UK has the highest energy prices in the world. And of course,
yes,
British politics, I was on a Swedish show earlier today, is in turmoil because of that. I mean, it's structural as much as anything. We've had five prime ministers in a short time. And it's because the Brits haven't worked out how they can combine their fantasies about world empire, as it were, in the modern and the realities, So it doesn't really matter. I mean, Starmer's hated personally, they say, but every prime minister would have made a
exactly.
mess of it. And I find it very difficult to persuade the Swedes of this, that it's not down to personal issues or Islam or something like that. It's structural economic issues. So how bad is it? And it's interesting because, I mean, America holds the whip hand, but we are the ones who are more affected than the United States. So there's a mismatch there. I mean, we're not in control of our own destinies. And then it doesn't look as if there's going to be any unity. I mean, Europe is still as divided as ever. I mean, the European Union is papering over the cracks, but we can't really combine. And America's still our daddy, and we still have daddy issues. We can't resolve ourselves. We don't know the debate has barely even started. But concretely, where do you think, how will Europe be affected? I mean, paint a scenario that everyone can understand in terms of, soaring prices and fertilizer shortages and so on.
Well, let's use a word that I think is apropos to characterize the institutions across Western Europe and also the United States, by the way. And I'll develop that thesis a little bit later because we need to talk about what's happening in the United States. We are not in a position of dominance or you might say residual power the way that people think. We have serious internal issues of social cohesion. All of the problems in Western Europe we have in the United States, okay? And you could argue we have them on a bigger scale. So I'll
Yes,
talk
yes.
about that in just a moment. The word I would use to characterize Western Europe, and I've been to a lot of these countries, sans the United Kingdom. In fact, I was supposed to take a trip to Belfast and London last year. Instead, I went to Moscow. So it's quite a divergence there. But my hope was to go to the UK and get on the ground and find out exactly what's going on. That being said, I do have a lot of friends over there, and I hear rumblings. But the word I would use is obsolescent. So when considering the United Kingdom in particular, we have reached a point, and I'll just use it as a microcosm, in which there are no political solutions for the economic problems that you face. We're not quite there yet in the United States, at least not in the public mind. But I think in the United Kingdom, as evidenced by Restore UK, some of these national protests that are gaining momentum that aren't going to go away, there's a realization that there is no parliamentary self-correcting mechanism to deal with the situation in the United Kingdom. And by the way, that's also true in France. The Fifth Republic is obsolescent, it's anemic, it is not corrective, cannot correct the social scarring that's gone on in that country for several decades for very similar reasons. And I think that's doubly the case in Germany as well, where the AfD continues to do well. A lot of people, I think they're misinterpreting some of these parties. Look, I don't know that AfD, for example, is a revolutionary mechanism, but what it is, without question, is it's a sounding board for the disgust, for the anger, for the frustration
Correct.
that the electorate feels with the German Federation. Okay, the answer to your question, Peel, is simple. You're going to get some kind of a revolutionary experience in these countries. Now, why do I say that as assertively as I do? These governments, and they all fall under the EU in one way, shape, or form anyway. The international regulatory bodies. In the United Kingdom, you might say it's the City of London, it's the banking houses, all these kinds of things. They have operated, they meaning the elected governments and the intelligentsia, people like Keir Starmer, these administrators, they have operated in a world of cheap energy and cheap credit their entire careers. They've never seen a world like this. They don't understand it. This is why they've made such mistakes in Ukraine as well. They don't really understand the British economy. They don't really understand the standard of living is falling. They don't understand outside of Westminster Abbey and some of these choice neighborhoods what the hell is going on in their societies. I think that's true in France. I think that's true in Germany. And when I say these things, people look at me aghast and they say, well, that's impossible. No, it's not. The pathway to ascension in Congress, in Parliament, in the EU Parliament, it's all the same. You have to accept the sort of boilerplate EU technocracy and what they believe. You have to accept that. Otherwise, you're out. You're out. And so now we're in a very dangerous situation, in which you have technocrats who do not understand that the world has changed, even inside their countries, don't understand that cheap energy and cheap credit are gone, and therefore they are not implementing any real reforms, any programmatic adjustments whatsoever to deal with the sledgehammer that's coming. And just to be clear, we're not going to sort of glide path into this crisis. When you start hitting tank bottoms, when you start running out of oil, the lights turn off. They just turn off. You experience a kind of industrial shutdown. And I think that something like that is what the United Kingdom is going to face. And there will be serious consequences for that on the street because, as you gentlemen know, there is already unrest in that country. And what's superimposed on top of all this is an immigration crisis that isn't about immigration anymore. It's about the existential existence, the preservation of the British ethnic population. That is on the verge of extinction because it doesn't control its institutions and it's being replaced demographically. So you add all this together, you've got a combustible mix, and we're getting very, very close to that explosion.
If I may, another follow up on that, Cam, something you just said again, the sting in the tail. What you said about the threat to even basic traditional English ethnicity will either come as a total shock and surprise to our viewers, or people will have a gut immediate reaction and say, "Oh no, he's being racist. He's being on the wrong side of World War II. This, that, and the other." Now, I'm not saying this is skepticism. I completely share your assessment, and my background is British and Irish myself. before I've been in America for the past 40 years, and Pele too is at least as English as he is Swedish. So we both have seen and observed at first hand exactly what you are pointing out. But I'd like you to go further into this. Explain to our viewers why what you're saying is not exaggeration, as Perry and I fully agree with you on how it's actually happening, how it's playing out on the ground, what the actual realities in England today are.
Yes, well, look, I've been to a lot of countries. I think about 35, and I've lived all over the world. South America, I have been briefly to the Middle East. I've been all over Europe. As I mentioned, I've spent some time in Asia. And what's the number one fault line? What is the source of acrimony, that's a consistent theme across the world? It tends to be ethnic differences, right? You take a country like India, for example. I think it was Lee Kuan Yew that said India is not a real country. It's essentially 30 nations that are stitched together with British rail lines. Well, why did he say that? Because you have 3,000 castes in India, because you
Yes,
have tens of religions, because you have all kinds of different ethnicities that do not cohere. And having a political mechanism to sort of ameliorate all of these differences, it just doesn't work. The British elites, in particular, since World War II, they have flatly denied that that is a self-evident and well-established condition of human affairs. That if you
I
put
agree.
people that are different together, you're going to get a combustible mix. And so, in addition to ignoring that people are fundamentally different, they tend to have different values, they tend to have different worldviews, which is why you have a diversity of mankind. You have different civilization sets, you have different trajectories, et cetera, which I think is a very good thing, by the way. They have ignored that and they have cultivated nations within nations inside of the United Kingdom in particular. And what has happened is that as the economy has gotten worse and worse, essentially these ethnic divisions are now beginning to go hot. So they were always sort of there. People self-segregate. They do in the United States too, by the way. We haven't figured out the formula to overcome these things any more than anybody else does. But now that the economy's bad and the fiscal situation in the United Kingdom in particular
Mm.
is reaching emergency levels. I mean, you mentioned a moment ago that we've cycled through all of these prime ministers. Well, it's not all just because of political rancor. It's not all just because the institutions are obsolescent. It's because they've got a financial situation that they don't know how to deal with because it
Correct.
means destroying the social welfare state. That's the glue holding all of these diverse peoples together because otherwise they'll tear each other apart. And I think what's happening now essentially is that you've got a critical mass of these folks. Obviously, they're not all Muslims, but many of them are. It's the same thing in France, by the way. And they're organizing themselves politically, and they're beginning to command authority and leverage the political class to do their bidding. And that's an emergency warning to the English middle and under classes who have no representation, whose standard of living is falling, and who are looking around in their various neighborhoods and they don't recognize their own country anymore. And the response to all of this from the government is to condemn them. And it doesn't much matter whether you're talking about Labor or you're talking about the Tories, it's all the same routine. You know, we'll censure you, we will virtue signal, we'll tout the virtues of democracy and diversity
Mm.
while condemning anybody that calls attention to the fact that London is Londonistan. That's where we are today.
Very interesting. I mean, I think that the British are is self-imperializing in a way. I mean, the standard imperial trick is to yoke peoples together and then run the resulting community by favoring one of them. So in British India was run by controlling the Muslims and using them against the Hindus. And in a way, I would you might say that the Soviet Union they yoked Eastern Ukraine together with Western Ukraine so that the Ukrainian nationalism wouldn't grow. What they should have done after 91 was to separated those Ukrainians out, so they wouldn't have this ethnic problem, which they subsequently have had. You know, and in a way, so the British have done that. They imported Indians to the Caribbean and and that it leaves disaster everywhere it goes. And now they're importing people into their own country
This is a
And
very
in a
good point.
way, sorry.
I just want to say one thing, and I apologize for interrupting, but there is an
No, please.
important distinction in what you're talking about. India, as I said a moment ago, functionally is not a real nation state. You
Right,
could argue it's a civilization state, but it was, in other words, it was always frustrated by these internecine conflicts. The
right,
same thing is true in Ukraine, okay? It's sort of a bastardized
Mm.
state. England is a real country.
right.
It's a real nation with a
Absolutely, yeah.
real ethnos. And so I think your sort of strategic framework is correct, but England is not a social construct.
Mm,
It's social construct. It is a reality
mm.
embedded in that ethnos, and I don't think that Westminster Abbey understands that.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, reason maybe why India is so unsuccessful and China is successful is that Indians are. I mean, everyone says liberals and leftists say India is such a wonderful example, the world's largest democracy. Everyone elects, and there's no controlled authoritarianism, whatever. But maybe that's the reason why India isn't successful because it's a country of 10 religions and hundreds of ethnicities and so on. Anyway, yeah, I mean,
That's
I
right.
think it's sorry, yeah,
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, part of the reason why the Chinese in particular, look, again, the West just does not understand. It does not understand what's going on in China. I think that's true about the Russians as well.
mm,
Um, China is not an authoritarian state. That's the wrong way to look at it. It is a civilization state with a continuity of history. And what the Chinese have done is essentially that they have reaffirmed the social contract that
Yes,
has defined Chinese civilization for a long, long time. And essentially, that was stability and prosperity. And Xi Jinping is not the head of the Chinese Communist Party. He's effectively the emperor with the mandate of heaven. And so, at
exactly.
every level of Chinese society, okay, from the central government to the provinces, and bear in mind, it's the provinces that really run China, by the way. This is not well understood, again, in the West. There is this social contract that's driving the institutions and the society in the same direction, such that the standard of living rises and that things are improving. That social contract on that scale does not exist in India. It just doesn't,
mm,
despite, by the way, the good of the British Empire, which
mm,
was to build the infrastructure, which was to create sort of the administrative organs. Those things they inherited. The Chinese didn't get them.
right.
But even with that scaffolding, India couldn't make it work for exactly the reason you mentioned. There is no broad-based social contract. It is a very fractured and corrupt society, and that has undermined their ability to ascend. Now, that being said, India has made strides, but it's muddled. It is not a dead sprint, which is what the Chinese have done.
If I can go, I first of all, I've traveled extensively and worked professionally, reported widely across Asia, and my assessments over the decades very much are the same, very much the same as yours, Cam. And there's another point that you made before I'd like you to go into because as you know, it's totally ignored in Washington. And that is, there is this cliche of gallant little Taiwan, a wonderful little nation that is going to be swallowed up and genocided by big, bad, evil China. First of all, Taiwan, of course, has always been part of Greater China in the beginning. Secondly, for the past 100 years, Taiwan has been used by other sea powers, the British, then the Japanese, very horribly by the Japanese, and then by us as a existential threat to the very existence of China, which the Chinese are well aware of, and as you well know, and we are ignorant of. But the third and key point is the Taiwanese through history have never been fighters. They have been the Czechs of East Asia. And not only is that my assessment, I think from your body language, it's very much yours too, but I was told this by a former very eminent American geostrategic figure, the late Lieutenant General William Odom, who became head of the National Security Agency, I think back in the 1980s before he retired. It was a very different agency then, of course, but before it became it evolved under George Bush Jr. into its current Frankenstein monstrous, uncontrolled and uncontrollable form. But Odom, who was the last thing in the world from being a fake macho imperialist, predicted then that the Taiwanese, if they fought a war, would lose it because they would fight it on the wrong Confucian principles as opposed to the right Sun Tzu principles because of the inherency of their culture. But secondly, and most crucially, they were not warriors and never had been, and it was not inherent in their culture. Would you disagree with that or agree with it? What's your assessment on Taiwan? Because my view is you hit the nail on the head that
Yeah.
we are looking to defend a country that will never defend itself.
Yeah, look, I think the Taiwan issue, frankly, as an American, has nothing to do with our interests. It's
I
none of our
agree.
okay. That let me just say that as a preliminary. I would say three things. The first is that there is this legacy of the century of humiliation. That is to say that the Chinese are still now recovering. I think mentally, psychologically, they've turned a corner. There's no question about it. They're beginning to exert their influence on the world with a bit more self-confidence in the Chinese way. It doesn't mean boots on the ground. It doesn't mean they're going to come and dominate your country. It means that they're not going to permit you to do that to them, really, more than anything else. So that's number one, is that they're regaining their sense of self-confidence. And the key word is reintegration. So all of these legacy, colonial, or otherwise dominated elements of China, they want to reintegrate. And Taiwan is probably the last and final step in that regard. That's number one. Number two is that the skinny on Taiwan from a lot of Westerners is essentially that the Taiwanese population has been de-Sinified, largely based on Japanese colonialism. Now,
Yes,
I have
exactly.
been to Taiwan, but I did not spend much time there at all. So I can't really speak to that. I have my doubts. The worldview of the Chinese is ethnically centered. It was always about the Han Chinese. If you're a member of the Han Chinese, it doesn't much matter what your geography is. You're a part of Chinese civilization. It just so happens that Taiwan is both. It's both ethnically Chinese, and I think historically it was territorially part of China as well. So I think it remains so to this day, though there are others that make claims that, as I said, Taiwan has sort of been heavily influenced by the Japanese, and so they have taken a different path. I don't think that that's true, and I think as evidence of my claim, the opposition party in Taiwan, they already have back channels with Beijing. In fact, I think a
Exactly.
major figure in the opposition party just took a trip and had a meeting, I think, with Xi Jinping. Perhaps you can correct me on that, but I think that that happened. And then
It did.
thirdly, and this is very important for Americans because part of what drove this war in the Middle East is not just APAC. And by war in the Middle East, I mean America's attack with the Israelis on Iran. Part of what drove that conflict is not just APAC. It's not just the Zionist power in the United States and control of Congress. It was also Persian expats or Persians
Yes.
who were born in the
Very
United
good point.
States. And the reason why is because in their mind, Persia today or Iran today is the sort of Islamic terrorist state that depropertied their family decades and decades ago. Now, I don't think that that's the case. I think Iran has actually developed as a power as well, and I think it's a very different country today than it used to be. But a lot of the expats that help fashion American foreign policy, that's not the world they live in. That's also true for the Chinese. So a lot of the American-born Chinese, to them,
Oh,
China today is Maoism 2.0. No, it is not.
Mm,
There's no connection to that whatsoever. It's sort of like saying Putin is a Stalinist reborn.
mm,
The world has changed. These
mm,
are post-Soviet, post-Maoist leaders in
mm,
both countries.
mm.
The West does not understand that, but there are many Chinese that still think that way. I think some of that thinking is also the case in Taiwan, but as China modernizes, as people look at Shenzhen, as they look at Shanghai, they're beginning to realize that China is effectively a provincially decentralized, governed free market masquerading as an authoritarian power, because that's what it is. By the way, just as an aside, having been to Japan and spent time there, Japan is sort of an authoritarian state masquerading as a democracy. The real
yes, I know Japan well, and that's exactly right. It's a
the
very
real
humane and
authoritarian state
tolerant
is
one,
Asia.
but it's uh,
Yeah.
Rather like sweet in that way, Pele.
Yeah. I'm afraid we've got to wind up there, gentlemen. Incredibly interesting. I mean, our
Yes,
elites, our media are way behind the curve. And I mean, they would benefit enormously from watching our show here because, and as you said, I mean,
excellent.
the exiles, I mean, all the Cold War warriors, plus the old Russians and the Ukrainians whose ancestors left for the prairies of Manitoba or whatever 800 years ago, now fantasizing about Stalinism reborn in Russia, and all the holdovers in The Economist and in the think tanks and so on. They still think they're fighting the last war mentally. But we know that the generals that fought the last war in previous kinetic conflicts tend to lose. So that's where we're heading. And we need
Badly.
to get real and smell the coffee here in the West. Anyway, I'd love to have your perspective on where we should go, what we should do. But I think we're going to have to leave that for another time. So thank you so much, Cam
Come
McGregor.
back
Thank you so
soon,
much,
Cam. It was a
Martin.
pleasure and a privilege to have you.
Absolutely
Thank you so
fantastic.
much.
The
Take care.
conversation, and things are going to change by the week. So pay attention.
Come back and guide us on